Principle of process. X that the first analysis of an actual entity, into its most concrete elements, discloses it to be its impressions of prehension, which have originated in its process of becoming. All further analysis is an analysis of prehension. Analysis in terms of prehension is termed prevision. She that every prehension consists of three factors: a good subject, which is prehending, namely, the actual entity in which that prehension is a concrete element; b the datum, which is prehended; c the subjective form, which is how that subject prehends the datum. Prehensions of actual entities, i.e., prehensions whose data involve actual entities, are termed physical prehensions, and prehensions of eternal objects are termed conceptual prehensions. Consciousness is not necessarily involved in the subjective forms of either type of prehension. She that there are two species of prehension: a positive prehension, which are termed feelings, and b negative prehensions, which are said to eliminate from feelings. Negative prehensions also have subjective forms. A negative prehension holds its datum as inoperative in the 24. The speculative scheme. Progressive compressance of prehensions constituting the unity of the subject. She that there are many species of subjective forms, such as emotion, valuation, purposes, aversion, consciousness, etc. xiv, that a nexus is a set of actual entities in the unity of the relatedness constituted by their prehensions of each other, are what is the same thing conversely expressed constituted by their objectifications in each other. Xp that a proposition is the unity of certain actual entities and their potentiality for forming a nexus, with its potential relatedness partially defined by certain eternal objects which have the unity of one complex eternal 36 object. The actual entities involved are termed the logical subject. The complex eternal object is the predicate. XCI, that a multiplicity consists of many entities, and its unity is constituted by the fact that all its constituent entities severally satisfy at least one condition which no other entity satisfies. Every statement about a particular multiplicity can be expressed as a statement referent either A to all its members severally, or B to an indefinite sum of its members severally, or C as a denial of one of these statements. Any statement, incapable of being expressed in this form, is not a statement about a multiplicity, though it may be a statement about an entity closely allied to some multiplicity, i.e., systematically allied to each member of some multiplicity. XTII, that whatever is a datum for a feeling has a unity itself. Thus the many components of a complex datum have a unity. This unity is a contrast of entities. In a sense, this means that there are an endless number of categories of existence, since the synthesis of entities into a contrast in general produces a new existential type. For example, a proposition is, in a sense, a contrast. For the practical purposes of human understanding, it is sufficient to consider a few basic types of existence, and to lump the more derivative types together under the heading of contrast. The most important of such contrast is the affirmation negation contrast, in which a proposition and a nexus obtain synthesis condition to which the process of becoming conforms in any particular instance. It has its reason either in the character of some actual entity in the actual world of that concrescence, or in the character of the subject which is in process of concrescence. This category of explanation is termed the ontological principle. It could also be termed the principle of efficient, 37, and final causation. This ontological principle means that actual entities are the only reason, so that to search for a reason is to search for one or more actual entities. It follows that any condition to be satisfied by one actual entity in its process expresses a fact either about the real internal constitutions of some other actual entity, or about the objective aim, conditioning that process. The CA to Barrow scheme. 25. The phrase, real internal constitution, is to be found in Locke's essay concerning human understanding 3:15, and thus the real internal is generally in substantive unknown constitution of things, whereon their discoverable qualities depend, may be called their essence. Also the terms prehension and feeling are to be compared with the various significations of Locke's term idea. But they are adopted as more general and more neutral terms than idea is used by Locke, who seems to restrict them to conscious mentalities. Also the ordinary logical account of propositions expresses only a restricted aspect of their role in the universe, namely, when they are the data of feelings whose subjective forms are those of judgments. It is an essential doctrine in the philosophy of organism that the primary function of a proposition is to be relevant as a lure for feelings. For example, some propositions are the data of feelings with subjective forms such as to constitute those feelings to be the enjoyment of a joke. Other propositions are felt with feelings whose subjective forms are horror, disgust, or indignation. Subjective aim, which controls the becoming of a subject, is that subject feeling a proposition with the subjective form of purpose to realize it in that process of self-creation. 6. That the fundamental types of entities are actual entities, and eternal objects, and that the other types of entities only express how all entities of the two fundamental types are in community with each other, in the actual world. 38xx. That the function means to contribute determination to the actual entities in the nexus of some actual world. Thus the determinateness and self-identity of one entity cannot be abstracted from the community of the diverse functionings of all entities. Determination, as analyzable into definiteness, and position, where the finiteness is the illustration of select eternal objects, and position is relative status in a nexus of actual entities. XXI, an entity is actual when it has significance for itself. By this it is meant that an actual entity functions in respect to its own determination. Thus an actual entity combines self-identity with self-diversity. XXII, that an actual entity by functioning in respect to itself plays diverse roles in self-formation without losing its self-identity. It is self-creative, and in its process of creation transforms its diversity of roles into one coherent role. Thus, Becoming is the transformation of incoherence into coherence, and in each particular instance ceases with this attainment. XXIII, that this self-functioning is the real internal constitution of an actual entity. It is the immediacy of the actual entity. An actual entity is called the subject of its own immediacy. XXIV, the functioning of one actual entity in the self-creation of another actual entity is the objectification of the former for the latter actual entity. The functioning of an eternal object in the self-creation of an actual entity is the ingression of the eternal object in the actual entity. XXV, the final phase in the process of compression, constituting N. 26. The speculative scheme. Actual entity is one complex, fully determinate feeling. This final phase is termed of satisfaction. It is fully determinate A as to its genesis, B as to its objective character for the transcendent creativity, and C as to its prehension positive or negative of every item in its universe. XXVI, each element in the genetic process of an actual 39 entity has one self-consistent function, however complex, in the final satisfaction. XXVII, in a process of compression, there is a succession of phases in which new prehensions arise by integration of prehensions and antecedent phases. In these integrations, feelings contribute their subjective forms and their data to the formation of novel integral prehensions. Negative prehensions contribute only their subjective forms. The process continues till all prehensions are components in the one determinate integral. Satisfaction. Section 3. There are 9 categorial obligations. I. The category of subjective unity. The many feelings which belong to an incomplete phase in the process of an actual entity, though unintegrated by reason of the incompleteness of the phase, are compatible for integration by reason of the unity of their subject. E. The category of objective identity. There can be no duplication of any element in the objective datum of the satisfaction of an actual entity, so far as concerns the function of that element in the satisfaction. Here, as always, the term satisfaction means the one complex fully determinate feeling which is a completed phase in the process. This category expresses that each element has one self-consistent function, however complex. Logic is the general analysis of self-consistency. E. The category of objective diversity. There can be no coalescence of diverse elements in the objective datum of an actual entity, so far as concerns the functions of those elements in that satisfaction. Coalescence here means the notion of diverse elements exercising an absolute identity of function, avoiding the contrast inherent in their diversity. IV. Category of conceptual evaluation. From each physical feeling there is a derivation of a purely conceptual feeling whose datum is the internal object determinate with the definiteness of the actual entity, or of the nexus, physical self. The category of conceptual reversion. There is a secondary origination of conceptual feelings with data which are partially identical with, and partially diverse from, the eternal objects forming the data in the first phase of the mental whole. The diversity is a relative diversity determined by the subjective aim. feeling. The K-Glorious Team. 27P. The category is transmutation. When in accordance with category IV, or with categories IV and PT1, and the same conceptual feeling is derived impartially by a prehending subject from its analogous simplet physical feelings of various actual entities in its actual world, then, in a subsequent phase of integration of these simple physical feelings together with the derivate conceptual feeling, the prehending subject may transmute the datum of this conceptual feeling into a characteristic of some nexus containing those prehended actual entities among its members, or of some part of that nexus. In this way the nexus, or its part thus characterized, is the objective datum of a feeling entertained by this prehending subject. It is evident that the complete datum of the transmuted feeling is a contrast, namely, the nexus, as one, in contrast with the eternal object. This type of contrast is one of the meanings of the notion, qualification of physical substance by quality. This category is the way in which the philosophy of organism, which is an atomic theory of actuality, meets a perplexity which is inherent in all monadic cosmologies. Leibniz in his monadology meets the same difficulty by a theory of confused perception. But he fails to make clear how confusion originates. The category is subjective harmony. The Val 41 relations of conceptual feelings are necessarily determined by the adaptation of those feelings to the contrasted elements congruent with the subjective aim. Category I and category B jointly express a pre-established harmony in the process of compression of any one subject. Category I has to do with data felt, and category B with the subjective forms of the conceptual feelings. This pre-established harmony is an outcome of the fact that no prehension can be considered an abstraction from its subject, although it originates in the process created of its subject. See the category of subjective intensity. The subjective aim, whereby there is origination of conceptual feeling, is O intensity of feeling A in the immediate subject, and F3 in the relevant future. This double aim at the immediate present and the relevant future is less divided than appears on the surface. For the determination of the relevant future, and the anticipatory feeling respecting provision for which grade of intensity, are elements affecting the immediate complex of feeling. The greater part of morality hinges on the determination of relevance in the future. The relevant future consists of those elements in the anticipated future which are felt with effective intensity by the present subject by reason of the real potentiality for them to be derived from itself. It's the category of freedom and determination. The concrescence of each individual actual entity is internally determined and is externally free. This category can be condensed into the formula, that in each concrescence whatever is determinable is determined. The decision 42 of the whole arises out of the determination of the parts, so as to be strictly relevant. the notion of complete abstraction is self-contradictory. For you cannot abstract the universe from any entity, actual or non-actual, so as to consider that entity in complete isolation. Whenever we think of some entity, we are asking, what is it fit for here? In a sense, every entity pervades the whole world, for this question has a definite answer for each entity in respect to any actual entity or any nexus of actual entities. It follows from the first category of explanation that becoming is a creative advance into novelty. It is for this reason that the meaning of the phrase, the actual world is relative to the becoming of a definite actual entity which is both novel and actual, relatively to that meaning, and to no other meaning of that phrase. Thus, conversely, each actual entity corresponds to a meaning of the actual world peculiar to itself. This point is dealt with more generally in categories of explanation E and P. An actual world is a nexus, and the actual world of one actual entity sinks to the level of a subordinate nexus in actual worlds beyond that actual entity. The first, the fourth, the 18th, and 27th categories state different aspects of one and the same general metaphysical truth. The first category states the doctrine in a general way, that every ultimate actuality embodies in its own essence what Alexander 3:43 terms, a principle of unrest, namely, its becoming. The fourth category applies this doctrine to the very notion of an entity. It asserts that the notion of an entity means an element contributory to the process of becoming. We have in this category the utmost generalization of the notion of relativity. The 18th category asserts that the obligations imposed on the becoming of any particular actual entity arise from the constitutions of other actual entities. The four categories of explanation, ex tunc constitute the repudia. 3 cf. Artistic creation and cosmic creation. The subjectivist principle. The notion of vacuous actuality is very closely allied to the notion of the inherence of quality in substance. Both notions in their misapplication as fundamental metaphysical categories find their chief support in a misunderstanding of the true analysis of presentational immediacy, v. Part 2, ch. 2, sec. I and V. It is fundamental to the metaphysical doctrine of the philosophy of organism, that the notion of an actual entity is the unchanging subject of change is completely abandoned. An actual entity is at once the subject experiencing and the subject of its experiences. It is subject superject, and neither half of this description can for a moment be lost sight of. The term subject will be mostly employed when the actual entity is considered in respect to its own real internal constitution. The subject is always to be construed as an abbreviation of subject-superject. The ancient doctrine that no one crosses the same river twice is extended. No thinker thinks twice, and, to put the matter more generally, no subject experiences twice. This is what Locke ought to have meant by his doctrine of time as a perpetual perishing. 44. This repudiation directly contradicts Kant's first analogy of experience, in either of its ways of phrasing first or two NGT editions. In the philosophy of organism it is not substance, which is permanent, but form. Forms suffer changing relations. Actual entities perpetually perish, subjectively, but are immortal objectively. Actuality in perishing acquires objectivity, while it loses subjective immediacy. It loses the final causation which is its internal principle of unrest, and it acquires efficient causation whereby it is a ground of obligation characterizing the creativity. Actual occasions in their formal constitutions are devoid of all end. Determination. Potentiality has passed into realization. They are complete and determinate matter of fact, devoid of all indecision. They form the ground of obligation. But eternal objects, and propositions, and some more complex sorts of contrast, involve in their own natures indecision. They are, like all entities, potentials for the process of becoming. Their ingression expresses the definiteness of the actuality in question. But their own natures do not in themselves disclose in what actual entities this potentiality of ingression is realized. Thus they involve indetermination in a sense more complete than to the former set. A multiplicity merely enters into process through its individual members. The only statements to be made about a multiplicity express how its individual members enter into the process of the actual world. Any entity which enters into process in this way belongs to the multiplicity, and no other entities do belong to it. It can be treated as a unity for this purpose, and this purpose only. For example, each of the 6 kinds of entities. 30. The speculative scheme. Just mentioned is a multiplicity, i.e., not the individual entities of the kinds, but the collective kinds of the entities. A multiplicity has solely a disjunctive relationship to the actual world. The universe, comprising the absolutely initial data for an actual entity is a multiplicity. The treatment of a multiplicity as though as 45 has a unity belonging to an entity of any one of the other 6 kinds produces logical errors. Whenever the word entity is used, it is to be assumed, unless otherwise stated, that it multiplicity is to an entity of one of the 6 kinds, and not to a multiplicity. There is no emergent evolution concerned with a multiplicity, so that every statement about a multiplicity is a disjunctive statement about its individual members. Entities of any of the first 6 kinds, and generic contrasts, will be called proper entities. In its development, the subsequent discussion of the philosophy of organism is governed by the beliefs of the subject-predicate